second engineer, preacher of the Abyssinia, gave a complete statement to the newspapers, including the following. Quote, "This is the third time I have been in a fire at sea. On previous occasions, we were able to either completely subdue the flames, or, at any rate, keep them under control until the vessel reached port. Then, however, the outbreak was discovered when we were only 300 or 400 miles from home. On this occasion, we were 1,500 miles from land."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Abyssinia in Flames.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Abyssinia had been built in Govan in 1870. The 3,651-ton iron-hulled screw steamer was owned by the Guion Steamship Company and was in operation between China and Canada. The Alaska, which was one of the prides of the Guion Steamship Company, was in need of repairs, however, and so while she was being repaired, the Abyssinia was placed temporarily on her route between Liverpool and New York. As she departed from Liverpool for New York, in early December of 1891, she had an entirely new crew. The 88 crew members, under the command of Captain Murray, had all been transferred to the Abyssinia from the Alaska. This did cause some complications because it meant that none of the crew was able to give anyone any real details about the ship or her history when they were later asked. The Abyssinia made the voyage in 14 days and had a 2-day turnaround in New York. She arrived in New York on the 11th, and on the 13th she was ready to depart for Liverpool. The Abyssinia had originally had an emphasis on carrying passengers, but over time had been converted to be able to carry more cargo, though at the cost of passenger accommodations. As she departed from New York, she only had 39 second-class passengers on board and 20 people in steerage. The rest of the space on the ship had been assigned to general cargo, which was now a routine process on the ship. On the trip to New York, much of the steerage deck would be filled with coal for the voyage, and as the ship had burned down coal on the voyage across the Atlantic, the deck space would be free in New York. This allowed the ship to take on cargoes of cotton, which was separated from any coal that remained on the deck with temporary wooden bulkheads that were erected while the ship was in New York. Due to the temporary and hurried nature of the storage built for the construction of the cotton, it was later admitted by the carpenter that he had cut corners in parts of the construction. Parts of the bulkhead were erected with the wood being 2 boards deep, with one set of planks covering the seams of the first planks put in place, so there were no gaps, but the parts where the carpenter felt there would be less strain during the voyage were built with only 1 layer of planks. Since the storage was temporary, it also lacked the fire-extinguishing methods that were available on other parts of the ship. Still, not a lot of thought was put into the entire operation as the ship departed from New York on the 13th. Though the crew was new to the Abyssinia, it was business as usual for the ship. By the 17th of December, there was a need for the remaining coal on the steerage deck, a total of 50 tons, to be transferred down into the bunkers to replace what the ship had burned. The ship's donkeyman was placed in command of a crew of 3 trimmers to complete this task. The 3 trimmers were landsmen with no experience, who were working with their passage home, but then again, moving coal was not exactly skilled labor. The second engineer, who gave the instructions to the donkeyman about the project, did not think to tell him that the cargo on the other side of the bulkheads was cotton, but he did warn him to ensure that there was no smoking, and to be mindful about the lamps that they were using for light, since they were working with coal. The lanterns they were using were the same ones used in the coal bunkers. Simple, exposed flame affairs that could easily cause disaster if they were knocked over. The coal was not completely moved on the 17th, and the men were sent down again on the 18th to complete the task. By now, at least 2 of the trimmers said that they had realized that the cargo was cotton because they could see uncovered white bales through the cracks in the wooden bulkhead. Though the donkeyman started the work with the trimmers again on the morning of the 18th, he was not able to remain for long. One of the furnaces on the port boiler developed a leak, and the donkeyman was called away to help with the repairs. In his place, a more experienced trimmer by the name of Tumulty came to supervise the other 3. How much supervision Tumulty provided would later be up for debate. He had been told to stop the other 3 men from touching the lanterns or smoking, but one of the trimmers, a man named Dawson, admitted that he had smoked in the coal space, and 2 of the trimmers said that they had handled and moved the lanterns. Still, when the 4 men went to their meal at noon, none of them noticed anything amiss. 2 of the trimmers returned to work from their break before the others, and when Tumulty noticed that Dawson had not come back from break, he went in search of him, leaving the other 2 men to work unsupervised. Shortly after he left, Dawson arrived, but as Dawson began to go into the coal area, he said that he noticed sparks flying from one of the lanterns. And then one of the bales of cotton that they had seen exposed to the bulkhead before caught fire. The trimmer who had been hanging up the lantern said that he never saw sparks, but when Dawson suddenly shouted to him and came running towards him, he had turned to look and seen the fire. The 3 men tried to beat up the fire themselves, but realizing that this was having no effect, Dawson ran to the deck to raise the alarm. The news that there was a fire in the cotton cargo was enough to mobilize Captain Murray as well as his chief officer immediately. The chief officer brought a crew of men carrying a hose with him, but when they arrived at the manhole they would have to pass through in order to reach the cotton, the smoke drove them back. The chief officer was able to look down and said that he did not see any flames there, only smoke. But when he looked through the fiddly grating on the deck, he could see that the cotton below was a solid mass of fire. Since this fire was not close to where the trimmers said they had seen the fire originate, there was some discussion that the fire might have started well before the men realized it, and some of the papers claimed spontaneous combustion, but the court would reject this theory in the end. They felt that if there had been a fire on board prior to 1:15 in the afternoon, someone would have smelled smoke or noticed flames, and that since they hadn't, there was a clear account of a starting point. There was no need to speculate more. It seems as though the fire had simply blazed through the highly flammable cotton at an extremely high speed. Several attempts were made to reach the fire by the crew. They were driven back by the smoke every time they attempted to climb down to the steerage deck. The grate in the deck above the fire was too small and inconvenient to allow much water to reach the fire below, and that was also quickly abandoned. As a final effort, the crew attempted to chop through the deck right above the fire so they could pour water down that way, but this effort showed how unfamiliar they were with the Abyssinia. Under the wooden deck proved to be an iron one, and this too was given up as impossible. It was becoming increasingly clear to everyone on board that there was very little hope for saving the Abyssinia. The crew began to ready the boats. Due to the small number of passengers on board, there were plenty of boats for everyone. Though the waves were choppy, and there were concerns that the boats would not last long after being launched, in a choice between a ship quickly being consumed by fire and the boats on rough seas, however, the boats were looking like an increasingly better option. Throughout, it was agreed that both passengers and crew remained perfectly calm and orderly, following all directions from the officers. As for the officers, it was reported that they had remained calm as well, helping to reassure people while also trying to ensure that the evacuation of the ship would be an orderly one. That was not to say that the passengers and crew were not anxious. especially as they got closer and closer to when they were going to have to take the boats. Fortunately, about half an hour after discovering the fire, the North German Lloyd Line ship, the Spree, came into sight and was signaled. On learning the situation, Captain Willigrod and the Spree agreed to lay alongside, though at a safe distance, in case the Abyssinia needed to evacuate. A decision that was made at 2:15 in the afternoon. With the Spree nearby, the passengers and crew were allowed to bring what luggage they had that was not in the hold of the ship, which lengthened the evacuation but meant that the passengers were able to keep some of their valuables and personal items, a rare thing in such circumstances. All of the boats of the Abyssinia were put into use, and the Spree sent 2 boats as well. The last people to leave the Abyssinia were the officers, with Captain Murray entering the boat at about 4 in the afternoon. The boat had only traveled about 200 yards from the Abyssinia when the mainmast fell. The entire midsection of the ship was by now completely ablaze. The final resting place of the Abyssinia was unknown, though considering her condition as they left her behind, no one believed that she would remain afloat much longer. There were no reports of her being seen by any other vessel. Fortunately, for those who had been on her, Captain Willigrod and the passengers of the crew of the Spree proved to be incredibly generous hosts, as they were able to travel to Southampton in relative comfort. Captain Willigrod would not overlook another ship in difficulties, however. As they got closer to the shores of England, a Gateshead vessel that was traveling in ballast signaled to them that they were in trouble, and launched a boat to head to the Spree. The fears that had plagued the evacuation of the Abyssinia about the high waves and small boats proved to be well-founded, and there was a grim reminder of how lucky the Abyssinia had been to have no loss of life. The boat, which was carrying 5 men, was upset before it could reach the Spree. 4 of the men proved to be good enough swimmers to hold their own until they could be pulled from the water by the crew of the ship and a boat sent by the Spree. But a 5th man succumbed, even though one of his companions had done everything he could to hold him above water until help arrived. This was quickly turned into allegations that people had panicked on the ship, and a member of the crew had jumped into the water and was lost that way by the newspapers, something that the crew took deep offense to, and were quick to correct. When the Spree reached Southampton, the people rescued from the Abyssinia were loaded into a tender while the Spree's band played them off. They in turn cheered and thanked the captain and crew for their generous treatment until they pulled away. Once on shore, the people who had been rescued were divided, with most of the crew remaining to answer the inquiry into the loss of the ship, while the purser and second engineer escorted the passengers by train to Liverpool, thus completing their voyage on land rather than on sea. It was found that Captain Murray and the chief engineer had not used the time on the Spree to make any inquiries to the trimmers about what exactly had happened in the hold to start the fire. The courts began their own formal investigation. The trimmer Dawson, meanwhile, sued the Guion line, saying that he had lost £25 worth of items in the fire, and that it was due to their negligent storage of the cotton. This suit was heard first, and the allegation that they had not stored the cotton safely was vehemently denied by the carpenter, as well as the 4th mate, who had been in charge of overseeing the loading of the cargo. The courts found the testimony of the 3 trimmers more credible, however. The testimony of the men who worked for the line as their profession had contradictions, and seemed as though they were given in the interest of protecting their employer and therefore their employment. The 3 trimmers had no such motivation, since they were not sailors at all and were unlikely to take such a post again, and their testimony was all consistent. Dawson was awarded his damages, and the inquiry into the loss of the Abyssinia took note, and agreed that the trimmers were the most credible witnesses to be heard. In the end, it was decided that the 4th mate had allowed the cargo to be loaded in a sloppy manner, though he was allowed to keep his certificate. It was noted that the second engineer would also have been found at fault if it could have been proven that he was aware of how close cotton and the coal were to one another, but it was not something that anyone could prove. It was agreed that Tumulty should have never been left in command of the less experienced trimmers. He had been too lax in his supervision, but that had been the fault of the donkeymen, not the second engineer. The second engineer was also allowed to keep his certificate. Captain Willigrad and his life-saving efforts were not forgotten. The Board of Trade awarded him a gold watch and chain for his kindness and humanity. They also awarded binoculars to his second and third officers, who had taken command of the 2 boats that had gone to aid the evacuation of the Abyssinia. Each of the men who had gone with them as boat crews were given £3. Considering the high praise that was given to them for their efforts by the passengers and crew of the Abyssinia, it was a well-deserved reward. For more information, please see Volume 12 of Accounts and Papers of the House of Lords from 1892, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.